Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The location of the State Library on Kurilpa Point was historically a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we proudly continue that tradition here today. Thank you everyone for coming again, and Marie-Louise Ayres was unable to come as she had to attend an urgent meeting today and sends her apologies, but I would like to welcome Debbie Campbell, who is the Director of Collaborative Services for National Library, who has stepped in at short notice to talk to us today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marjorie, and thank you for welcoming me to the State Library of Queensland. Marie-Louise did ask me to convey her disappointment and deep regret that she couldn't deliver her presentation today. But let me assure you that this presentation is actually hers, so I'm just the mouthpiece. And I would also like to acknowledge the original owners of the land on which this beautiful building sits and pay my respects to elders past and present. I will be covering a number of areas today. I won't be talking about how Trove works or what it can deliver to your users, as we're starting with the assumption that you're all familiar with Trove and have already seen the way that your patrons engage with the service. I will touch briefly on the background to Trove's development before delving deeper to provide you with some insights into Trove's current content and user base, and what we know about user behaviour and engagement. And I'll also provide some information from our point of view on what the Queensland picture looks like and what it could be. Then I'll turn to look at new opportunities for Trove as disseminator, not just a discovery service, and look at Trove's strategic directions for the next 3 years and how we see Trove fitting into the changing cultural and information landscape. And last, we hope to leave you with some challenges that could mean that together we can build Trove into an even better service by 2015, which is the target we've set ourselves. Now, most of you will know that the National Library has a long history of developing services to help users discover Australian collections held in cultural and research institutions across the country. Most of these services, dating back to the 1990s, web services that is, were focused around specific formats, while some were subject-based. Each of these services relied on a national willingness to collaborate, leadership from the National Library itself, commitment to supporting research, and willingness to invest in the service of Australian users. At the time, each of the services was highly innovative, and some, like Picture Australia, were copied around Australia and the world. They were very popular with our users and have become indispensable parts of Australia's research infrastructure. For many reasons, we started to think about a new framework in late 2006 and worked on this idea, then called the Single Business Discovery Service, throughout 2007. The library decided to fund the project in the 2008-09 financial year, and in October 2008, the project officially commenced with a dedicated project team in place. We launched Trove Stage 1 in October 2009, continued development on Stages 2 and 3 in 2010, and completed Stage 4, the final formal project stage, in May 2011. And development has continued since then, although at a much slower pace. In June 2012, we released Trove version 5. In our world, numbers count. Trove is big, not just in content, but in usage. Last month, we hit a record new daily high of 64,204 unique visits to the website, and we're still averaging 64,000 visits a day. Those unique visits have doubled in the last 18 months, and growth does not look like flattening anytime soon. In the first quarter of this year alone, there were nearly 53 million Trove page views. Trove dominates access to the library's website, accounting for 65% of its page views and slightly more than 65% of our bandwidth. Trove users are rapidly switching to mobile devices, with a doubling of the percentage of these users in the last year to just over 10%. And we are taking this into account in our development planning. Trove's user engagement has been phenomenal and far in excess of what we could have expected. Once users arrive at Trove, they have plenty to do and they're doing more of it. Every month we see growth of between 2 and 4% in each of the user engagement activities. While newspaper correction dominates, and we had fun recently costing that text correction, if it was done by our lowest paid level, it would come up to the value of $12 million so far. Creation of lists is growing fastest of all, and now there are almost 17,000 lists in Trove. This continuing growth tells us that our engagement features are not flashes in the pan that excite people for a while and then are forgotten. We are also in the process of redesigning the Trove forum based on usage observed. You all know that Trove is very large with more than 315 million resources, but you may not be so clear on the shape of that Trove content. By the end of the first quarter of this financial year, this was the breakdown of Trove content by work type, and you see those reflected in the zones for access. All statistics and graph require explanation, and in this case you should note that what is being counted is actually a bibliographic record, so one metadata record equals one, a count of one. In the case of newspapers, the count is actually the number of articles, not titles, not pages. In the case of websites, it's actually pages that are counted. As you can see, the largest content type is journal articles, followed by Australian newspapers and archived websites. Books follow a long way distant, and other content types are represented by very small figures. We can take a different shape view by looking at what percentage of each work type is available online, as shown here in purple, and then further, what percentage of each work type is Australian content and is online, as in the blue. Trove promoters sometimes believe that all content in Trove is available online and that we have somehow leapfrogged all sorts of copyright and resourcing hurdles to make it so, but unfortunately that's not the case. The reality is that roughly 1/3 of all Trove content is freely available online, another third is licensed content available only to patrons of subscribing libraries, and another third is metadata records describing resources which are not online and which need additional steps for access. It makes sense that 100% of the content in the newspapers and archived website zones is available online, and so those types have been excluded from this graph. However, it's also worth looking at each of the other work types, in particular what percentage of all works described in Trove is available online and what percentage of those are Australian content. So, as with previous notes on the statistics, there are some caveats on these figures. The percentage of books online almost certainly overstates the case. Many book records are associated with online content, such as the publisher's description, but the whole work is not online. So, although the proportion of Australian books available online looks tiny, it is almost certainly tinier. The Diaries Letters Archive Zone includes material that a discriminating human being would believe belongs in another zone. Many unpublished works, such as articles, turn up in this zone because when we decide which zone content belongs to, Trove has to make a best guess based on the metadata that's present in the record. So take the percentage of diaries, letters and archives with a pinch of salt, as it's almost certainly skewed by records which come from OCLC's Oyster service, which aggregates content from a large number of research institutions. Particularly repositories tend to say everything is online, but it's not really. Even so, many of you will know that the real proportion of Australian manuscript collections actually available online is minuscule, and that in most cases the online content is a finding aid describing the collection rather than the actual items themselves. Another point to note is that the majority of online content, with the exception of newspapers, websites and pictures, is not held or made available by Australian collecting institutions. It has been contributed by many international libraries, museums, galleries, archives and universities to OCLC's Oyster service, from which we've harvested around 9 million records. While Oyster can easily be searched online in its own right, Trove has integrated this high-quality content source to make its resources more accessible to Australians. Also, a surprising amount of online Australian content discoverable through Trove is not being delivered by Australian organisations. Just about any search will reveal that many pictures, maps and journal articles are Australian in nature but are contributed by others via Oyster. Of course, this reveals the extent to which Australian-related materials have made their way into collections around the world, especially in UK institutions. For example, we hope to include the Europeana dataset in Trove sometime in the next year or so, and this will further increase the amount of high-quality, rare, and even unique Australian online content that we would really like to make more easily discoverable. Having said all that, you can see that 45% of all pictures in Trove are online and Australian, 9% of maps, 3.5% of manuscripts, give or take those finding aids, nearly 2% of journals, articles and data sets, 1% of music, sound and video, and 0.1% of books. So there are many things here to acknowledge and some room for thought in terms of where we might put our collective digitisation effort to boost the proportions of content that are both Australian and online. It's important to balance those views of the shape of Trove's content with a view of the shape of the use of that content. So I'll just go through how these figures were derived. This graph is based on the number of searches in each of Trove's zones, which we think is the best proxy for actual use. We've chosen to exclude from this graph those users who start their search from the Trove home page, the All view, which accounts for just over 10% of all searches. As you can see, there are very significant disparities between the quantity of content available for a particular work type and the number of searches of that work type. If we work from the smallest first, you can see that the use of the pictures zone outweighs the available content by more than 5 to 1. Music, sound and video and books are used a bit less than half of what we'd expect, and maps around 1/3, perhaps because of the low percentage that is available online. The archived website zone is used at a fraction of its content, but this is largely an artefact of what is being counted. So with a grain of salt, we should note that what we're really doing here is putting up information about websites which we will be expecting to use more of in the future. On the other hand, the diaries, letters and archive zone is used twice as much as we might expect. The people zone is even Stevens, and the list zone is used much more than we would expect based on its content, because in effect lists is just a reuse of what's in Trove already. So this is all very interesting. The main ones to look at here are newspapers and the articles, journals, datasets view. In both cases, we're counting at the metadata record level. Use of the newspaper zone is 3.5 times what we might expect, reflecting the huge popularity of Trove's digitised Australian newspapers. Even if we include the use of the homepage search, newspapers accounts for 75% of all Trove activity. And that means that we, Australian libraries who worked together for years on the AN plan and who are now cooperating to digitise Australian newspapers through the library's contribution model, are definitely on the money in terms of where we have chosen to put our digitisation effort. I should also note that previously, before we switched off Picture Australia, the use of the newspaper zone was even higher. It was in the lower 80%, but this has changed since we switched it off, and now the images are accessible through Trove only. Now, in contrast, use of the journals, articles and dataset zone is vanishingly small compared to its heft in the database. The content of this zone includes descriptions of journals and freely available articles, such as those available through Oyster. However, 125 of the 141 million items discoverable through this zone are licensed articles contributed by just 2 vendors, Gale and Informant, with more than 124 million of those 125 million from Gale. These resources are only available to patrons of subscribing libraries and were selected because they were included in the NSLA core set of e-resources, NSLA, the National and State Libraries of Australasia. From the e-resources, some additional Gale databases not in the core set were also included in Trove. The library has done an initial review of the Trove article service in August and recently communicated with the NSLA CEOs about the outcomes of this review. We found that the infrastructure we built is effective for connecting users with content which they were entitled to use, and that use of the content via Trove looks quite healthy compared to what we knew about the use via some individual libraries. And this use is actually increasing in popularity. We've seen a 9-fold increase in attempted click-throughs to licensed content since this time last year, a few months after we released the stage of Trove that contained this. We were very surprised to discover that the service is not actually reaching its target audience. We built this part of Trove primarily to benefit patrons of NSLA and public libraries. However, we found that the majority of the service use was by patrons of university libraries, whom we believe are already well served by their large research libraries and sophisticated discovery layers. We also found that including and maintaining additional databases in Trove, which has no revenue stream and is entirely funded from the library's recurrent budget, that the cost of adding them is beyond the library's means, and we've decided that we will not expand the service to include additional vendors or databases. We will certainly continue to offer Informant content with its strong Australian focus and its clear attraction for Trove users. Article for article, Informant content is much more heavily used than is Gale content. We're currently working with Gale with a view to making a final decision on whether to include all current content or to reduce the offering with a focus on content that is of most interest to patrons of public libraries. And we're extremely grateful to both vendors for their willingness to work with us in these very untested waters, and they are continuing to work with us in the future. So that's the shape of Trove content for now. Trove has 3 major sources of nourishment. The first is the NBD, the National Bibliographic Database. Every record that is in Libraries Australia, with the exception of Serial Solutions records, and I have to say I'm actually negotiating with Serial Solutions at the moment, every record in Libraries Australia is pushed through to Trove. So for libraries, the most important Trove contribution pathway is actually the National Bibliographic Database. Libraries Australia has contributed 23 million records to Trove, and this number increases every time an Australian library adds a bibliographic record to the NBD. Of course, Queensland libraries who are not members of and do not contribute to Libraries Australia will not see their collections represented in Trove. Exposure through Trove represents a significant additional return on investment for cataloguing effort. So some of you may want to think about whether Trove changes the Libraries Australia value proposition for you. The second source of nourishment is the newspaper's digitisation program. We now have 7.5 million pages delivered through Trove, and that is going to be boosted significantly over the next 3 years due to the National Library's contribution model. We expect to deliver at least 3 million more pages by 2015, thanks largely to a very significant State Library of New South Wales project funded by the New South Wales government in its last budget. The National Library is about to start mass digitisation of books and journals, and it is possible that a similar contribution model for that type of content will see collaborative development and delivery of more Australian published content. The third source of nourishment is the work that we do to harvest records describing digital collections in Trove, and this is the work that my team actually does. Aside from the NBD, Pandora, which is already in the NBD, and newspapers, we have 109 current contributors to Trove, shown in blue here by state. Universities account for a fair chunk of those 109, as all university libraries contribute their research outputs to Trove. Libraries account for another very large chunk, with a fairly modest sprinkling of galleries, museums, archives, and other cultural organisations. Queensland has more than we would expect, given its population, I think thanks in part to the Picture Queensland service. We also have a number of international contributors, including OCLC's Oyster service, a subset of the Hathi Trust digital imprint, which is managed by many university libraries in the US, Open Library, which is a service of the Internet Archive, and Gale. The red column indicates potential contributors that we are aware of. There are probably many more, with the great majority currently shown as being from New South Wales, the ones that we're aware of. Now, last financial year, we added 7 major contributors, and I just got news through that we've added another one, which is the National Museum of Australia, which is great for us because their technical capacity is actually modest. This year, we will add many more by working with groups of potential contributors who either have a similar business need, as is the case for universities, most of whom have a funding imperative to contribute researcher data this financial year, and by that I mean they're actually looking to describe their researches, not just their research outputs, or potential contributors who use a similar platform. For example, we are currently working with a number of small museums who use the web-based eHive collection management system. So if we turn to Queensland, these are the Queensland organisations currently contributing direct to Trove. The State Library of Queensland and the universities also contribute via Libraries Australia. The universities on this list are contributing records from their research repositories, and they're increasingly contributing records about their researchers through the Trove party infrastructure, part of which is the Trove Identity Manager, which we call TIM. Primary Industries is also contributing records of its research outputs, and I hope that continues. As you can see, most of the agencies on this list are public library services, with only a few from other sectors. Monument Australia is not a collecting institution as such. It's a privately funded discovery service for photographs of Australian monuments, and it has almost 20,000 records in its database which have flowed through to Trove. The Queensland Museum collection is described by their library, and the Performing Arts Centre has a very small collection in Trove. So in Queensland, as is the case across Trove, it is libraries which have seen the opportunities of Trove and its predecessors and what they offer, and have the institutional will and the technical know-how to contribute. It's important to note that our list of potential contributors includes everything from we think it's a good idea, or they've contacted us, or they are just about ready to contribute. The Queensland list is a very good snapshot of the various states along the collection pathway. This is very much like what a list of potential manuscripts collections would look like. In most cases, the organisation has contacted us. In a couple, we know they have content of interest, so we'll make the running when we can. And there can be long gaps between contacts, first, second and third contacts. People working in organisations move on, or their priorities change, or sometimes they just forget they've been in touch. And sometimes both we and they do a lot of work without getting to the payoff, that is, having their content visible through Trove. So to return to where we're at with each of the potential contributors on the Queensland list, Bond University's research repository is already included, but we know that they also have a separate image collection. The Department of Primary Industries and Fisheries, if it's still called that, contribute their e-research archive, but we also know that they too have an image collection of interest. The Department of Public Works has previously expressed interest in contributing. Toowoomba Council Library and Gallery contacted us in 2010 to ask whether they could join Picture Australia, but we haven't heard from them since. And the Queensland State Archives expressed interest in contributing to Trove, but when we last heard from them last year, they didn't quite have the technical capacity to do so then. And we know that the Queensland Art Gallery has some records and some online images, and we need to investigate further. The University of Queensland's Antiquities Museum uses eHive to describe its collections. And as I mentioned before, it is actually quite easy for us to work with a group of agencies that is using the same platform. eHive is particularly simple. It does use the OAI protocol, supports the OAI protocol for harvesting, and it's as simple as us plugging a base URL into the Trove harvester, and away it goes. So simple, in fact, that we don't even have to ask, but we always do. So here are the current contributors again, mapped to their locations. Even if we added those 7 known potential contributors, this picture would not actually change much. Unsurprisingly, the agencies are all clustered around the southeast corner, and there's nothing north of Cairns, although I don't think there are actually many people north of Cairns. I have been to Cape York. It's possible that other Queensland public libraries are contributing content, such as local image collections, via Libraries Australia. We just haven't popped them on here. And as we know, there are Queensland public library systems which are not members of Libraries Australia. So there are probably plenty of community collections in libraries further from that southeast cluster, which would be in scope for Trove. Now, we aren't able to travel around Queensland, but one thing that those of you who do visit regional and rural public library locations could do is to ask whether the library is a member of Libraries Australia, so seeking that return on investment. If they are, does the library have a local digital collection? And if it's not contributed to Libraries Australia, could they contribute those records to Trove? Do they not know about Trove, or have they thought about it and are just a little bit hesitant? And if we found there were many libraries which have collections that could be included in Trove, how could we go about communicating with them to tell them what they need to do in order to contribute? if they have a lack of technical know-how, could we do something about that, or could you do something about that? Most non-NBD and non-newspaper contributions are managed and undertaken by my Trove support team, as I mentioned earlier, with some sources of data, such as the really big Oyster and Gale data sets, requiring specialist IT resources. But my team actually acquires content using a number of mechanisms, with the Trove Harvester an essential piece of infrastructure to support smooth addition and updating of contributors' content. One of the Trove team's realities is, like the one faced by Special Collections colleagues, that while we'd like to do much more in terms of proactively shaping the collection, much of what we do depends on the circumstances of contributors. If we are approached by an organisation that seems ready, willing and able to give us their content, we'll work with them, and perhaps put on hold an organisation with high value content that we would really love to see in the service, but where we detect a lack of organisational capacity to do so. The reality is that we often have to make decisions about adding easier to get but possibly of less interest resources, or harder to get but really, really important resources. We don't forget the hard ones. We do get wins from time to time, and the National Museum is a case in point, but it's always a balancing act. So here, where it's referring to level of difficulty, all that means is that programmer intervention is required to add those sources, and APIs are a particular case in point. I'd like to turn back to the user perspective for a moment. Currently, we know very little about our users and what they need or want. One thing that we do know is that more than half of the user visits come from overseas, and that's really good. They're promoting Australian culture, but our focus is on providing services to Australians. We know something about Trove users who send us inquiries, compliments or complaints. We know what they tweet and are often lucky enough to stumble across what they've written or said about Trove, or where they've made a comment about how they intend to use it. We do know that many visitors visit Trove every day. We know something about the kinds of devices and browsers that they're using. And we know some things, but not enough about what they do when they're visiting. Now, the library's Paul Hagan, a colleague of mine whom you may know, recently analysed the National Library's website, the National Library's separate catalogue and use of Trove. Trove users stick for an average of 8 minutes 45 seconds per visit, compared to 3 minutes 11 seconds for visits to the National Library's website and 1 minute 19 seconds for visits to the library's catalogue. Australian users spend even more time, averaging 12 minutes 14 seconds on Trove, so that we know Trove is a very, very sticky service. We know that some Trove users are absolutely committed to text correcting, and you've heard my joke before, I can tell. The one about addiction? No, sorry. And research is happening right now on patterns of correction. Paul will be giving a paper on this at the online conference, which will be here in Brisbane next February. And there's also research happening externally on the motivations of the community when they're engaging with Trove in this way. And I'm hoping to be able to share some of that external research with you early in the new year. We know that Trove users align more or less with actual population distribution in our states and territories, although as you can see, Queensland use is lower than we'd expected based on population. From what we can tell, use by non-metropolitan users is below, but not alarmingly below population distribution. Non-metropolitan use looks particularly healthy for Queensland, and this mirrors our Trove enquiries, where just over 50% of inquirers from Queensland who told us their postcodes they were from outside the metropolitan and Gold Coast regions. But these are really just glimmerings of understanding, and there's so much that we don't yet know. So we will be doing a larger user evaluation this financial year to help us discover who our users are, what they are seeking, whether they find it, where else they might find it, and we hope lots of other things to help us understand our Trove user context and to build our services and content accordingly. And we will eventually report on the outcomes, although the analysis for such a large survey will take a while. So far I've been talking about what is in Trove, how it gets there, what the Trove content picture looks like, and what we know about Trove users. But with the delivery of the Trove API, which stands for Application Programming Interface, it's a technical term, with the release of the API in April, Trove moved beyond being an aggregator and discovery service to an open data store available for reuse outside Trove. Trove makes almost all of its records and all digital content available for reuse through the API, including newspaper text, user corrections, tags, and notes. Non-commercial users do not need to seek our permission to use the API for their own purposes, although we do like to hear about it. Commercial users need to contact the library to discuss their proposals prior to being issued with an API key. And so far there's about 90 people, 90 agencies that have registered to use the API. One of those people is Tim Sherritt. He's a digital historian and a digital history tool developer, and he's spoken about some of his projects, including this one, which he calls Query Pick. Tim built this tool to map occurrences of words and phrases in newspapers to build up his own picture of the mood of Australia at various times, and for many other kinds of historical enquiries. For example, when did the front page of newspapers become the place where the main news of the day went? As Grant will tell you, for many years in the 19th century, the front page was just full of ads and other things, not news per se. Now, although Tim started out his research by scraping Trove content, his job has been made much easier with the advent of the Trove API. So if you haven't seen an example of the kind of mapping that he does, this is a query pick graph that shows the occurrences of the word Trove in all Trove newspapers. This view is as a percentage of all available content rather than actual numbers. There wasn't much content in the first couple of decades of the 19th century, hence the word Trove appears to be incredibly common. In terms of numerical rather than proportional occurrence, however, its high point was in 1936, when it appeared 1,009 times. It seems that a lot of treasure troves were dug up from under old houses, old pubs and town halls in that year. It's actually a word that's not used very much, although it seems that we've brought it back into use over the last few years. Tim's tool is a fairly simple one, finding occurrences of words and then presenting them graphically. Other researchers have been experimenting with Trove's very large text base to develop programs that can learn certain kinds of associations that go beyond words and into concepts. And over the next 3 years, we expect to see some of these power uses of the content of Trove starting to bear fruit. Other researchers who have used Trove's API to experiment with alternative ways of presenting Trove images include Mitchell Whitelaw, who is an associate professor at the University of Canberra. Mitchell has a bunch of clever young PhD students who are all working on their quest to create richer visual interfaces to image-based content. And with funding from the State Library of New South Wales, Mitchell helped himself to the 7,000 images from the Manly Local Studies collection via the Trove API to create a visual interface which does not rely on search. So it went from this. Is there a better way to approach searching for images? To this. So this is actually a browse interface, and you just click on one of the images and it takes you through the decade. Mitchell has recently gone even further, releasing this prototype. And I can give you the URL for this actually if you're interested, but if you just do a search for Trove Mosaic, fantastic name, you'll turn it up. So when you do a search, it looks like that. And again, you can click on images. The prototype takes the first 500 search hits that it finds by using the API and then builds rotating mosaics to display that content. These examples pull Trove content out to external services or pull a dataset out to manipulate using analytical tools. But Trove can also be included in existing services. We have long anticipated that an Australian library might want to include content of interest to local patrons, but held by other collection organisations in their own websites. And this hasn't quite happened yet, but we hope it will. And we're assuming that the prize being offered for the 2013 GovHack, which will be given for using Trove content in some way in relation to existing services, will produce just such a result. So this is a small example of what I was talking about in relation to the API. Again, Paul Hagen has he whipped up this little service over the course of a long weekend after the VALA conference. It's a WordPress plugin which allows WordPress users, and there are lots of them, to use the API to find and display text from specific Trove articles. The text is displayed with full citations, and if the text has been corrected in the article, it will be displayed, it will be updated in this WordPress display. So you don't have to capture an older version of the article and keep it. It's just automatically displayed whenever you go to this WordPress blog. It's important to note that there are simpler ways of being powered by Trove. For example, the Queensland Government Agency Libraries have created a Trove user identity for QGAL, adding all QGAL libraries to the My Libraries list. And when they search Trove and limit their search to those libraries, they can view the holdings from the libraries included among their membership. And this is a really simple way to create an effective virtual union catalogue search. Sadly, with closures and other cuts, fewer Queensland Government libraries are Libraries Australia members, and we know at least one of this group has just cancelled membership, which means that their holdings will be removed from Libraries Australia and therefore from Trove. Now, I hope that's a clearer picture of Trove's shape, its potential shape, and includes some ideas for how it might generate special new services or augment existing ones. So I think you will not be particularly surprised by our proposed future for the next 3 years. Trove's strategic directions were developed with our Trove reference group, which includes wide representation from across the National Library. They arise directly from and are closely aligned to the National Library's strategic directions, which has 4 key goals: collect and preserve documentary heritage, make our collections and services accessible to all Australians, deliver national leadership, and achieve organisational excellence. Trove's strategic directions are most closely aligned with the second and third of the library's directions. They reflect the library's understanding of the current and likely 3-year context in the information and cultural spheres. We expect many more Australians to have access to fast broadband by 2015. If broadband's working. What's happened there? I'll keep talking while you... Oh, okay. Sorry. We expect that a majority of our users will also be using mobile devices to access content, and we expect users to be able to choose from an ever-growing array of online content, and will therefore focus on what we uniquely can do, including digitise Australian content and making it freely available wherever possible. We expect a Commonwealth cultural policy to be launched, and the National Library has worked hard to ensure that it goes beyond the performing and creative arts and into the crucial areas of how Australians can access, use and interact with their documentary heritage. We know that the Commonwealth Government is focused on inclusion agendas, especially ensuring that regional and rural Australians have access to the information and the opportunities that they need. We know that the school education landscape is in a period of considerable change, both through the Gonski Review and its implementation of the national curriculum, supported by classroom-ready digital curriculum materials. We don't expect a significant boost to funding for digitisation or delivery at the Commonwealth level, but are delighted that our Minister, Simon Crean, announced a useful addition to our base funding for each of the next several years, which we will put to good work in improving our digitisation and delivery output. Sadly, we do not expect the dream of national licences to high-quality e-resources to come to pass. A key factor in our decision to put less effort into including licensed article content and more into our niche role of freely available digital Australiana. For each of our Trove directions, we have described our aspirations and actions we plan to take over that time frame. We're currently implementing our new Trove information architecture. This is just the information around the use of the service, and we will publish these directions as part of that when it's complete. I've also brought some paper copies of the Trove strategic directions if you'd like to have them. I won't go through them all now, but just a highlight. To support building Trove's content, we have just completed the Trove Content Inclusion Policy, which will also be published soon. We are thinking about how we can provide one-to-many instead of one-to-one advice to potential contributors. In other words, how we can efficiently provide advice so we can work with a pool of self-sufficient and Trove-ready contributors. In an effort to build better services, we will enhance Trove interfaces so that all parts of the service are mobile friendly, or more so than they are now, beginning with the Australian newspapers interface next year. By early 2013, we're also planning to deliver a subject view covering the performing arts, replacing some of the specialist functions that we offered before through Music Australia and Australia Dancing, which are now switched off. And we will support and strengthen our online engagement with the Trove community through multiple social media channels, including with some new screencasts that we'll develop this financial year. With the big issue of building a sustainable business model for Trove so that we can enrich its content and invest in new service options in a scalable way, we will work hard to build capacity in the potential contributor pool to reduce overheads associated with adding new content and to maintain existing contributions. And we will investigate diversifying our funding base beyond the library's recurrent budget and those of libraries contributing digitised content, but we're not under any illusions about how difficult that will be. So, some challenges that we'd like to leave you with, which we hope will turn into concrete actions. Starting at home is always the first priority. We find that librarians, and especially CEOs, are often far too optimistic about the extent to which their collections are exposed in Trove. So, first things first, does your library contribute regularly and fulsomely to Libraries Australia and or to Trove? Do you know exactly what proportion of resources held and described by your organisation have been contributed to the national services? If you have described special collections or digitised content and you haven't contributed them to Trove, can we help you overcome any organisational, technical or financial barriers that are preventing your collections from appearing with all that content that I discussed earlier? Now that you know more about what Trove content is available online and is Australian, and what kinds of content currently attracts most Trove use, how will you use this information to drive your decision-making about building up your born digital collections and digitising your physical resources? Now you know that Queensland and non-metropolitan users are every bit as important to us as they are to you, and that Trove use by Queenslanders is below what we might expect based on population. What unique and regional collections do you think could be the focus of your digital efforts? We need every community in Australia to feel that it matters and allow them to be able to see their own story in Trove. That's actually happening in quite a big way in some of the other states. The disproportionate use of pictures and manuscripts suggests that there is a hunger for this material, but the State Library recently found that on an item-by-item basis, use of digitised publications significantly outweigh the use of other content types. If we can increase the number of Australian publications that are actually online, will this drive increases in this use of this kind of content? Beyond your own organisations, you all have local networks. Do you know of content, especially freely available digital Australiana, that would be perfect for Trove, but is sitting less discoverable than it should be in individual databases or websites? Could you spread the Trove word to convince those with suitable content, especially digital content, that participating in a national service will benefit them and their users? Can you convince them to think local but act globally, a phrase we've often heard? In your own networks, how could you incorporate the Trove message in your regular communications? How could we help you to be clear about that message and to work with you to start conversations with potential contributors? Many organisations with good digital collections lack the capacity to expose them to any aggregator, including Trove. We know they have limited staff or are run by volunteers and have little technical capacity. They're unable to set up a simple HCL mechanism or an OAI PMH repository to allow us to harvest their data regularly. Is there anything that you could do about this? Do you have the know-how in your organisation and could share it? Do you know of any volunteer or low-cost programs that match IT specialists to worthy organisations, especially those in more remote areas? Could you advocate for such a thing? 75% of all Trove users arrive via Google, so it's clear that our most effective marketing strategy is to expose Trove content to search engines. And Trove content actually rates highly in Google and other search engines because we are continually refreshing that content. We know that many Australians would benefit from Trove but don't know about it or don't know that it might help them with their inquiries. We don't have Ancestry's advertising budget, and we rely on our community, this community, to advance knowledge of Trove and what it offers. Many of you will already have strategies in place to promote Trove to your local patrons, whether you're engaging with them on-site or off-site. With so much content now available through a national service, is there a way that you could possibly change your messaging? How can you leverage Trove alongside your own services, especially with all that content which is important to your users but may not be in your own service? Could you provide us with feedback about what your local experiences are to tell us what Trove users want and need? And I mentioned earlier that we're undertaking a large-scale user evaluation this financial year, and we will be sharing those results with the community. And you're welcome to send us such input. We don't have to know about every like and dislike. We already get lots of those. But if you could consider what would be the best mechanisms to provide us with feedback and share information about how your users interact with Trove. So, I've mentioned a lot of things that we would be very keen for you to do for Trove. So, to turn that around, how could you use Trove to achieve the needs of your users? All of the developers of the Trove-powered tools I've just shown agree that the key ingredient to exploiting the Trove API is not programming skill, it's imagination and inventiveness, and the ability to move from what if to actually giving it a go. It's the same kind of imagination that we see working in the burgeoning app world, including identifying needs that we didn't even know we had, and then engaging with those opportunities that they open up for us. So the first step in thinking about how your organisations could be powered by Trove is to brainstorm, to be as wild as possible in thinking about how you could put it to work for your users. Play around, draw up some wireframes, have your bright young things, and those of us who are not so young, think about what will deliver most value to your communities. At some point, you are going to need to decide whether you want to integrate Trove content into an existing service or build a whole new web-based service. For example, would the State Library of Queensland want to dynamically include Trove content in its Queensland convicts information, so that any new Trove content, including user tags and comments, would be automatically updated in the SLQ site? Or is there a regional library service that would like to present a view of local photographs, newspapers, and even oral histories that just relate to that area? For standalone services, you will need to think about the lifespan and sustainability of your new service. For us, it's our intention to keep the content available for as long as possible. And if you are thinking about anything which will be large-scale and ongoing in nature, please contact us early so we can establish whether what you are proposing will fit in with Trove's platform and expected usage, and we can help you with that. So, our current strategic directions run from 2012 to 2015. It's still hard to know exactly how many of our specific actions we'll achieve and how many of our directions we will have met. But if I wanted to ask, how would I know whether this talk and its challenges that I have put to you have been accepted? How would we measure that? What we would like to see is absolutely every State Library of Queensland holding for every format included and current in Trove. More digital Queenslandiana, newspapers, pictures, websites, e-publications, music and moving images. Absolutely no digitisation programs which are incompatible for inclusion in Trove. More local studies collections held by public libraries. We can help with that, by the way, the compatibility aspect. More local studies collections, especially outside the biggest population centres, digitised and available in Trove. Should we put a number on it? Another 10 in 3 years' time? Or think about what the map of Queensland should look like in 3 years' time. We would love to see more unique and wonderful Queensland content so that Trove becomes irresistible for Queenslanders and use grows to levels that would keep us awake at night, wondering whether we can augment our infrastructure to keep up with demand. We'd love to see use patterns that match Queensland's population distribution, that mean people living in rural and remote areas are just as likely to use Trove as their country cousins. And we would like to see some fully established powered by Trove websites where you can build new services or augment your own by including Queensland-related content that we have aggregated from others on your behalf. So, I think Marie-Louise will be back to talk to you very soon. Thank you. Happy to take questions if there's time.
Just with regard to the government libraries, you mentioned that one was feeding into Trove, and since then it's no longer there, and therefore the content's no longer going through.
Lots of Queensland Government libraries feed into Trove from Libraries Australia. One is, it's just that one, I know several are actually closing or have closed recently. Whenever a Libraries Australia member closes, we take the holdings out of Libraries Australia unless some other arrangement is made.
So where is that held now though? You know, if it's no longer...
Look, I don't actually think I'm the right person to answer that question.
No one knows.
We just had a Libraries Australia meeting where we talked about this. Some collections are, please correct me if I'm wrong, some collections are going to warehouses just pending a decision about their future. And even in those cases, sometimes the holdings are updated and sometimes they aren't. So interlibrary loan is becoming more and more difficult.
I guess I was specifically looking at the digitised content.
Yes, that would be a solution if there was funding to be found. Oh, sorry,
with the arrangement, you know, 10% of your users come through to the just use the all search, but most people are actually searching in their formats, in particular formats.
Yes.
So with material contributed, you've got music, sound and video. Are you putting your oral histories there? Because I have tried to get clearer guidelines on how the algorithms you're using to take our records and put them into their categories.
Right.
I would really appreciate if that were, is that now published on the website? It's not really.
I don't think we've routinely published it. We can certainly send it to you. It's, you know, it's public information really. The zones though do have duplication. So for example, you would find an audio book in both the book zone and the sound zone.
Because people mostly are searching in specific zones.
Yes, and we don't make assumptions about which zone they should find it in, so we map those bib records to both. It does depend on the quality of the metadata that we get. Trove supports a lot of different metadata schemas, so Mark 21 is in RDA, the Dublin Core, it supports encoded archival content for corporations, families and persons, which is the people data. So whatever schema people use, we actually try and mine it to map to the most appropriate zone or zones.
Also, so if we do have a setting which shows it's audio content, say in the month leader, and it may be coming through our contributions for manuscripts, or like archival material, you'll put it in both.
If the codings are there, then yes, we would do material type. And also, by the way, if you find something of yours that you think is absolutely in the wrong zone, please let us know. We have uncovered a couple of rogue records, so we're happy to adjust or work out how to adjust those. And I think this lady down the front, that's my question first, sorry.
Have you done anything to say about the future of digital viewers? Because I found Picture Australia far superior as to view photographs. Maps, it's just disastrous trying to view a digitised map because they're so small. I mean, even so, is this on the agenda yet, or is this something waiting for?
You shouldn't have a problem with maps. I mean, we display thumbnails in Trove, but usually you can click through to the full version of a map.
Yeah, but you can't get it big enough on the screen because you're limited by the sizes. But anyway,
it depends on. Are you talking about National Libraries maps?
Any. I'm just wondering about digital viewers in Trove, whether there's going to be any upgrades in the foreseeable future, or is that something that's not on the agenda?
We can only redeploy what. How people digitise. So no, there won't be special viewers per se. I think it might depend on who has actually digitised the map as to what sort of navigational features you would be using, because we're not storing the maps in Trove, we're only storing the records with the link to the map. We pull back a thumbnail if it's available to show in the brief results, but that's about it. So we're not doing viewers, no.
Thanks for the presentation, Debbie and Marie-Louise. I think two quick questions now to follow up from Joan. It's that issue that we all have about our clients don't necessarily know, because you're right. I mean, when you click on a map, a digital map, it's taking you to whoever originally digitised it and whatever viewing experience they have. And it's this real potentially disconnected experience, seeing we've all done different things. So it'll be interesting to see how that progresses over time.
I think for that reason it's very important to get your branding right, and think about the pathways with which people are coming to your content, whether it's via Trove or not. If they're coming from a Google search and they're landing on your page, do they have all the information they need? I was doing a bit of exploration recently for another purpose, and I was going direct to records in local catalogues, and I couldn't find out how to order a copy of something in a lot of cases. So that's something else. So the branding, the layout of the individual page on which a result is presented is very important. Actually has nothing to do with Trove.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure if I missed it. I don't understand how libraries or organisations make a decision about when to go to Libraries Australia and when to go to Trove. And what does that mean for Libraries Australia?
That's a very tricky question. And it's one that we have discussions about internally as well. Generally what we do with a potential contributor, especially if they are a library, is that we look at whether there is a benefit to them to actually be a Libraries Australia member in the first instance. Because, if they have if the agency has a catalogue, and that catalogue is not available nationally, apart from people having to know where their website is, we're actually very keen to determine whether that library should become a Libraries Australia member, and then the return on investment is there because the records just flow through to Trove. If the agency is not a member, then and not a library, and the content is digital, then it comes straight through to Trove. We're not actually taking in agencies that only have records and nothing else, i.e. there's no digitised content attached to those records. There are no contributors like that direct to Trove.
Okay.
So again, it's an assessment about what you want to make known publicly and how. We've been very careful with our membership model of Libraries Australia to make sure it's, that there are options there for membership that we don't think are too difficult for agencies. I know that's still an issue for very small agencies. In some cases, to use a particular example, if we're aware of a very small agency that has done a little bit of image digitisation, it's unique content, we actually recommend that they load those images into Flickr, because we're maintaining a Trove pool in Flickr, which we harvest from regularly, and that's the way that they get that material into Trove. There is a different type of return on investment there, in that that collection has exposure through Flickr, which of course is a global service anyway. But we're interested in the Australianness of it. So there are options depending on which agency you are, what your budget looks like, etc., etc.
Makes sense.
Can I just ask something? We found that our photographic database, right, from Picture Australia, when it was on Picture Australia, the Google's not a problem. Now we've found that anything that was actually loaded from Picture Australia onto Trove, we can't search on Google. You can go onto Trove and find it, but you can't find it on Google. Now I have sent in a query to Trove, and they are saying it is a problem with some kind of mapping, but I was wondering, is it just our library, or is this something that other libraries are finding the same problem? That anything that was harvested on Picture Australia, you have to be on Trove to be able to find it. If you go to, if you try to find it through Google imaging, You can't find it.
Are you talking about the separate Google Images service?
No, this
Or just general Google?
Just general Google.
Okay.
And I'm finding that people, and I've sent the query a couple of times. In fact, this morning I just sent an update because I've heard nothing since July. And I just wondered what was happening there, because your comment about the number of people using Google because they don't know about Trove. And I certainly find that with people who speak to me. And I'm just wondering.
It should be working. If there's a mapping issue, I mean, I'll have to go back and check. But
Something to do with the question mark, and I'm sorry, I really don't understand the jargon.
okay.
I don't understand, I'm sorry.
Those question marks make all the difference.
Exactly.
No, if there's, that may well be the case. I mean, there may be some sort of, syntax issue which is preventing that. But if you'd like to give me your contact details, I'll chase it up when I get back and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, as I
You
say,
may have to change the syntax of the URL string or wherever it's.
Yeah, so they're not, when I've done it through the Trove comments and asking them what to do, they're just virtually saying it's something that might fix itself over time with Google. That's kind of been the feedback, which is a bit frustrating when there's 7,000 records sitting there that haven't been getting access from.
Yeah. We can actually, well, we can and we can't. Sometimes it is possible to ask Google to hurry up with re-indexing. We don't do that very often, but sometimes it does work, so I can look into that. But if you give me your details, I'll chase it up. Yeah. Any other questions?
Any more questions?
Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.